A central question in phonology concerns the basic elements of sound structure. A very popular view in this respect is that it is the phoneme that is the central element in phonology. To understand what a phoneme is and what it is not, we will proceed as follows. We will first of all perform an analysis of an input string. Then we will ask about the function of each particular element in that string. We will then perform a phonetic, or to be more precise, an articulatory analysis of that string and the elements within it. And we'll finally look at the distribution of some selected phones or sound units within that string. So let's start with our string. Here it is. Liz played with Paul. And now I want to be as precise as possible in transcribing the phonetic details contained. In other words, I have to apply a narrow phonetic transcription. And to signal such a transcription, we first of all need these angular brackets. And I will first use the set of symbols as supplied by the International Phonetic Association, and then in the next step I will add diacritic elements to add additional information. So here are the symbols. Liz played with Paul. Now, in a narrow phonetic transcription, I have to add diacritics to mark all phonetic details that are relevant. For example, we know that the alveolar lateral consonant in Liz is slightly palatalized. Liz. The diacritic for palatalization is a superscript J. Then the L in played, the alveolar lateral in played, is also palatalized, but at the same time it is slightly devoiced. So if you pronounce that very carefully, it is played. Then the other elements are pretty clear, but here we have a typical example of a plosive with full aspiration. So we don't say Paul, but Paul. And this little puff of air that accompanies a plosive at the beginning of a word in English, a voiceless plosive, can be marked by the superscript H, which stands for aspiration. And finally, the last element, this alveolar lateral, again, is now different. It's not palatalized anymore, but it is velarized, which you can mark by this additional diacritic. So this is the first result of our analysis. What are we going to do with this analysis? Well, first of all, let's look how these elements function within particular words. So here I have our velarized alveolar lateral, and I want to contrast it with some other elements. So let's first of all look at, here we have Paul in the first case with our velarized element, Paul. And now if I pronounce it Paul, again we would understand the name Paul. Only people would tell me, well, what sort of pronunciation is that if you say Paul, Paul instead of Paul? You sound like a foreigner, don't you? But people would clearly understand the meaning Paul. So it doesn't really matter whether we use the palatalized one or the velarized one, the meaning will be Paul. But what about Paul versus pork? Well, in American English this would be pork, but we're talking about British English here. So Paul versus pork. In terms of transcription, this would be pork, and this would be our Paul. So here clearly these two phones result in a differentiation of meaning. And the same applies to the next case if we replace the final element by z. So here we have our Paul again. And now we get pause. This will be the word. So in other words, here we have again sound units that result in a distinction of meaning if you put them in the same position. In other words, we have sound units that must be different somehow. We have the k on the one hand, we have the z on the one hand, and we have our l. Since we get differences in meaning, in the function, they constitute different so-called phonemes. That's the first approach. And by the way, these units that differ in one position are called minimal pairs. But what are we going to do with our alveolar laterals? Well, let's analyze them acoustically in more detail. They are all voiced, normally voiced, alveolar lateral consonants. Well, this one is D-voiced, but that's slightly different. So let's look at the articulation in more detail. So here we have the first one, and let's draw the exact tongue position, which somehow looks like that. So it's palatalized. So here in the palatal region we have some sort of narrowing.